So this week's Torah portion, the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Parshat Pinchas, sort of is linked to last week's Torah portion, the end of last week's Torah portion. Last week we read the story of Balak and Bilam. Balak was a Moabite king who felt threatened by the approaching Israelites. He commissioned Bilam, this pagan prophet, to come and curse the Israelites so that he could defeat them in battle. And Bilam could only bless the Israelites. But Balak had a plan B in mind if plan A didn't work. And so he entices the Israelite men to worship Baal Peor, the god Baal Peor, by engaging in sexual acts with Moabite women. And of course, because they are participating in this worship of Baal Peor, committing forbidden acts with Moabite women, and partaking of the sacrifices to Baal Peor, God is incensed, and God sent down a plague which affects the Israelites. There's a prince of the tribe of Shimeon, Zimri, who thinks it's the way to stop the plague is to deliberately do an act which causes a plague. And so he takes Cosbi, the daughter of Sur, a prince of Midian, into a tent to have sexual relations with her in front of Moshe and the elders. And when he goes into the tent, Aaron's grandson, Pinchas, is filled with zeal for God and passion. He takes a spear and he stabs the two of them in the act of doing forbidden relations, and he shish kebabs them, as I put it. And for that he's rewarded. So we pick up the story in this week's Parashat Pinchas, where God says, because Pinchas averted the plague by doing the act that he did, by murdering Cosbi and Zimri, he is going to be rewarded with a Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace. And his descendants will be rewarded with a Brit Kunat Olam, the covenant of eternal priesthood. Very problematic. This man commits murder and is rewarded with a Brit Shalom, with covenant of peace. What on earth is going on here? Indeed, the rabbis are troubled by this passage from the Torah. And they're very afraid that people might take inspiration from the story and commit acts of zealousness, killing others that disagreed with them, taking lives. And so we have an interesting teaching in the Mishnah, which says that anyone who steals a sacred vessel from the temple or uses enchantments or cohabits with a heathen person, that person can be put to death. And the rabbis discuss this in the Gemara, and they say that if such an incident happens, and a zealot comes to them and says, may I kill that person, may I take that person's life, the Sanhedrin should say no. Because he came in to ask permission, if he takes the life, it's murder, even if the person committed these acts, which according to the Mishnah, they can be put to death for. And they look at the story of Pinchas stabbing Cosbi and Zimri, and they say, he stabbed them at the time that they were committing this act, forbidden act. If Zimri had defended himself by killing Pinchas, Zimri would not have stood trial for murder because he was defending his life. If the two of them stopped their act a second before Pinchas stabbed them, Pinchas would be guilty of murder. They're very concerned and made a point of saying that committing murder is murder, no matter what the cause, no matter what the motivation. And perhaps because Pinchas did this act, his reward being a Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace, means that he has to act peacefully from now on and bring peace to the world and between fighting parties. We have another story in the Tanakh of a zealot. Someone was so impassioned for God, for love of God, that he committed murder. and that's the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet Elijah, who in rabbinic folklore is depicted as this wonderful grandfather figure, this, I call him the Jewish Santa Claus figure. He's going to herald the Mashiach, he's going to herald the time of redemption. But you read about him in the Tanakh, he's a very different figure. He's a rather frightening person. He lives in the wilderness, he wears a hair shirt and a big bushy beard, and I personally would not like to confront him in a dark alley. And there's a story that he prophesies in the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel, Achav and Isabel. And Isabel is considered to be a wicked woman because she brought the worship of Baal and Asherah into the kingdom of Israel. And her husband Achav allows her to build temples to these gods and to employ priests, bring priests from Tyre, from Lebanon. And Elijah is angry and says, because you forsaken God, the God of Israel, you'll suffer famine. And indeed famine does happen, there's drought. And the story in the book of Kings describes how Elijah then challenges the priests of Baal on a mountaintop, on Mount Carmel, which is just outside modern-day Haifa. Haifa is built on the mountain. He challenges them to a competition to see which God is the true God. He instructs the priests of Baal to build an altar and to pray to Baal, to send down fire, to consume the meat that's on the altar. And they pray and they pray and they pray for hours and nothing happens. Elijah mocks them and says, perhaps you need to shout louder. Perhaps Baal is a bit deaf. It's getting on in age. So they shout louder and they gash themselves and still nothing happens. And then he says, right, you've had your turn. He then instructs the Israelites to build an altar of 12 stones, a stone per tribe, to place wood on the altar and meat on the wood, and to dig a moat around the altar, and to cover the altar with water so much so that the water flows down into the moat, fills the moat. And he prays softly to God, and God sends down fire, destroys, consumes the altar as well as the meat. Not content with this, showing that God of Israel is a true God, Elijah then proceeds to throw off all the priests of Baal from the mountaintop to their deaths, which of course angers Jezebel, who puts out a contract on his head, if you like, pursues him, and so he flees. And he has to flee the cities, and he goes to Mount Horeb, which is also another name for Mount Sinai, the very mountain on which Moshe received the 10 utterances, one of them being Lo Tetzach, you shall not murder. He goes into a cave and he hides. And God calls him and says, what are you doing here? When God asks, what are you doing here in the Tanakh, it's a rhetorical question. God knows why. He was asking the person, where are you? What are you doing here? Where are you at? So this is God asks Adam and Eve when they hide from God once they find out that they're naked, when they discover they're naked after eating a tree of the fruit of knowledge. God asks, where are you? God knows where they are. Because God's asking them, where are you spiritually at this time? Similarly, God asks Elijah, why are you here? And Elijah says, well, I had to flee for my life because the people of Israel are not fulfilling the brit, the covenant. And then God brings fire, tremendous fire. And Elijah looks at the fire but doesn't find God in the fire. God brings an earthquake. God's not in the earthquake. God brings thunder. God's not in the thunder. And then Elijah hears Kol Damar Daka, a still small voice, small sound. And God's in that silent, small, soft voice. The thunder, the earthquake, the fire represent the actions of Elijah, the actions of Pinchas. But the still soft voice, the voice of love and compassion, of understanding, is where God is found. The characteristics of Pinchas and Elijah are so similar that there's a midrash that states that Elijah is the reincarnation of Pinchas, the same person. If you take it metaphorically, both have the same characteristics of being zealous and impassioned, not thinking what they do, and they do what they do. And the lesson of Pinchas and Elijah is that God's not necessarily in the acts of violence and the taking of life, but God is in a small, soft voice of understanding and compassion. Can you hear it, son? Amen.